What's your thoughts on government cover-ups or covert societies attempting to control humanity? Do you believe in ancient astronauts, intergalactic communication, or extraterrestrial visitations? Ever had an experience with disembodied spirits or the paranormal universe? Are these subjects fact or fiction? Each week, Tony and Eddie explore these unbelievable realities and beyond. Exclusively on Truth Be Told.
Hello and welcome to Truth Be Told with Tony and Eddie, where we believe in experience becomes truth. I'm your host, Tony Sweet, and joining me now in studio is world-renowned psychic Eddie Connor.
Thank you, Tony. Throughout centuries, questions have been asked of the many Gospels that never made it into the Bible. And today, we're talking about one of those Gospels. Tony, it's the Gospel of Judas.
Yes, Judas, the man that betrayed Jesus. Or did he? And did Judas die at his own hands? Well, today, author Mark Mattison is here to answer these questions and more with his new book, The Gospel of Judas.
And other questions to ponder are, how could a gospel about Jesus have been written in the name of his greatest nemesis? What does it really say about Judas, about Jesus, about the church, and what does it mean for us today?
Even more interesting that the rediscovery of the gospel in Egypt in the 1970s,
an initial publication in 2006 ignited an intense debate about Christian origins and their meanings. But to tell us more about that, please welcome the author of The Gospel of Judas, Mark Mattison.
Mark, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thanks for having me.
Well, I have to also say it's the Gospel of Judas, the sarcastic gospel. So this has already got a little sense of humor to it.
Well, yeah, I was really trying to set apart in the subtitle something of the character of the gospel, and that seemed like a very appropriate subtitle because this is one of the most caustic, it's actually the most caustic gospel I've ever read. It's like very, very critical and sarcastic, and very it's not very kind about church leaders of the century.
Well, I know when I watched a documentary about this, probably about a year ago, I mean, it contradicts so much about what the Bible says. I remember reading where, you can tell me if I'm getting this wrong, but Jesus actually told Judas to betray him. Was that correct? According to the Gospel of Judas, is that right?
Not necessarily. Incidentally, which of the documentaries did you watch? Was it the one from National Geographic or the History Channel? Or?
I think it was one of those. I don't remember which one,
okay.
But it was one of those.
Yeah, well, in the Gospel of Judas, so named because of the prominence of the character of Judas, there are a number of dialogues going on between Jesus and Judas. And the meaning of that dialogue in context, it was initially a little bit difficult to sort through because it was unclear initially whether Judas was being portrayed as a hero or as a villain. And to give some context to this, when the gospel was first publicly announced in April of 2006 by National Geographic, with their special airing 3 days later on television, these team of scholars who presented it, one of their principal points was that here was a text that argued that Judas worked with Jesus, that Jesus commended Judas, that Judas did what Jesus wanted him to do by turning him over.
Right.
Now, whether or not the gospel actually portrayed him as a hero or as a villain, however, has itself been a matter of controversy. One of the reasons, and I'd say there were at least 4 reasons, that the scholars who first worked with this gospel believed that it portrayed Judas in a positive light. The principal one is that prior to the rediscovery of the gospel, it was known only through one very brief reference in the 2nd century in about 180 when Irenaeus of Lyon wrote about it. And it was a very short passage in the first volume of his book Against Heresies, when he was arguing for the validity of only 4 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and arguing against other Gospels as well. The Gospel of Judas was was a Gospel that he specifically mentioned in this text. Excuse me. And in this text, what Irenaeus wrote was, he wrote, quote, "They declare that Judas the traitor was thoroughly acquainted with these things, and that he alone, knowing the truth as no others did, accomplished the mystery of the betrayal. By him all things, both earthly and heavenly, were thus thrown into confusion. They produced a fictitious history of this kind, which they style the Gospel of Judas." So in this text, Irenaeus talks about this gospel and about Judas being very knowledgeable and understanding so many things, to whom Jesus made many revelations, and that certainly is in the Gospel of Judas. But Irenaeus appears to have believed that the Gospel of Judas portrayed Judas in a positive light. Whether that was because he never read the Gospel or because he misunderstood it, like reading a satire, not quite getting the joke, the reference seemed to portray Judas in a positive light. So when scholars first began working on the Gospel of Judas and they recognized the Gospel, they already had this mindset, this framework that suggested that Judas would be portrayed as the protagonist in this Gospel. A second reason I think there was a problem was because this team was rushed. They had just 2 years within which to complete their work, and they were interpreting and commenting on the text at the very same time that they were translating and even reconstituting the text. By the time that the text came into the hands of responsible restorers in a foundation in Switzerland, it was already in 10,000 pieces. So they had to carefully piece it together under planes of glass and photograph it and rearrange the parts and try to put it together. So there were some translation issues that later on scholars were able to sort through. But there was no real peer review process. And the reason for this is because National Geographic required these scholars to sign non-disclosure agreements so that they couldn't share what they were working on with their peers. So it was really only after National Geographic got this huge media scoop and got to put this storyline out there that other scholars began to take a closer look, or have the opportunity to have a closer look and really work more with this text and scrutinize some of the reconstruction and translation decisions. And finally, and this is a pretty big reason as well, because this comes out very prominently in National Geographic's documentary. A lot of these scholars sincerely hoped, like Bart Ehrman and others, that rehabilitating the character of Judas would go a long way toward countering anti-Semitism within Christianity, because the negative portrayal of Judas in the Gospels and in all throughout Christian history has often been used as a way of criticizing Jews. In fact, the name Judas literally means Jew. And very often in Christian history, when Christians have persecuted Jews, calling them, Christ killers and so forth, that plays very much into the caricature of Judas, for example. So the idea of vindicating the character of Judas was seen as a possible way to address the issue of anti-Semitism. So for those 4 reasons, many of these early scholars initially thought that the Gospel of Judas portrayed Judas in a positive light. Now, it definitely portrays Judas in a more positive light than the other 12 disciples. Of all of the disciples mentioned in the Gospel of Judas, there's the 12 and there's Judas, and that's essentially it. And Judas is the only disciple with whom Jesus carries on extended dialogues. The Gospel of Judas is very clear that Judas understands more about Jesus than any of the other 12 disciples. And Jesus makes a very critical statement later on in the Gospel. And this was a statement that was initially interpreted to mean that Judas was a hero and he was better than the 12. Because Jesus told him on page 56, and this is when Jesus told Judas that he was about to turn him over and betray him. He said to Judas, "You'll do more than all of them because you will sacrifice the humanity that bears me." And that's where it's been interpreted by some that that Jesus was asking Judas to turn him over. Uh, but it doesn't really say that. It says you're going to sacrifice, the human who bears me or the humanity who bears me. And that critical phrase, you'll do more than all of them. The phrase "do more" is in the Coptic. It literally just means more than, and it can be a good thing or it can be a bad thing. And arguably, what Jesus is saying in this text is that the 12 disciples are completely wrong and they're completely misled, but you're even worse than they are because you're actually going to sacrifice me. So if that's really the meaning of the text, then although Judas is the main character in this text as far as the disciples are concerned, is still not necessarily portraying him as as someone who is doing the will of Jesus or working alongside Jesus. Does that make sense?
Yeah, totally makes sense. And I'm going to go back a little bit because when exactly was this discovered? Because I know it was discovered then set for quite a few years in a vault, wasn't it?
That's exactly right. And the history of this text is really, really fascinating. As you mentioned in your introduction, it was discovered probably around 1978, sometime in the 70s. It was discovered by someone, we don't really know who, in a tomb alongside the Nile River. And that's the perfect place to find these documents, and that's why so many of these documents are preserved in Egypt. If you take this papyrus, you stick it in a box, you stick it in a chest or a jar, you stick it in a cool cave, those things can last thousands of years. And so that's where the Gospel of Judas was found in a codex along with 3 other texts. Now, a codex is the earliest version of a book. The codex replaced the scroll as being more economical and efficient. The way what they essentially figured out was that they took papyrus sheets and cut them up and fold them in half and bound it in leather that you could fit a lot more content in there. And so this Coptic translation of the Gospel of Judas was the third among 4 texts in this book that was discovered in this tomb alongside the Nile River. Local folks who discover these kinds of antiquities know that they're very valuable and can bring a lot of money on the market. So it was sold to an antiquities merchant or dealer named Hannah. He was going to turn around and sell it, but in a burglary, it was stolen from him, and he wasn't able to get it until maybe a little bit later. He actually went to Europe and somehow managed to recover the codex. The next time it turned up was in May 15, 1983, when he met in Geneva with 3 U.S. scholars to offer to sell the manuscript to them. Between the 3 of them, I believe they had no more than $50,000 or $100,000 that they could spend on it. Wow. But he was asking $3 million, and obviously they didn't have that kind of money. And in fact, no university or institution was willing to pony up that kind of money for something that they didn't know if it was a fake or if it was legitimate or if it even if the transaction was legal. So what Hannah ended up doing was in March of 1984, sticking it in a safe deposit box in a bank in New York City, where it literally sat decomposing for 16 years
in
the safe deposit box, just crumbling into pieces.
That's a shame.
And it wasn't until the year 2000 that a Zurich antiquities dealer named Frida Nussberger Chakos contacted him because she was looking for this book. She'd heard rumors about it. And she contacted him and purchased it from him for about $300,000. Here's where it gets even more tragic, because in September of that year, she sold it to a well-known American dealer named Bruce Farini. And his intent was to flip the manuscript. He already had a buyer lined up, and he was going to sell it for a profit and then pay her back. But the deal fell through, so obviously she demanded it back right away. Well, in the meantime, to preserve the manuscript, he'd stuck it in a freezer
Oh my
which is a
God.
terrible thing to do for an ancient manuscript.
I'm surprised there's anything left.
Exactly, exactly. In modern day documents, you put it in a freezer, that's fine. Ancient papyrus, it dries it out and becomes even more brittle. So by the time he got it back to her, it was literally crumbling into pieces. And uh, I don't know if it was known at the time, but he actually held on to some fragments that he did not return because he was hoping to sell them and make a profit off of them.
Oh gosh.
And as a result, that adds more to the drama of the story, which I'll get to in just a bit. But when she recovered the document, she realized something needed to be done. She sold it to a foundation in Switzerland, and they began to contact scholars, and that's when they really began in earnest the necessary work to restore this document that was one of the worst preserved documents ever in these Coptic codices. So they had to again piece it together like a jigsaw puzzle, very very carefully placing the fragments in between panes of glass. You may have seen that in whichever documentary you watched, for
Right.
instance.
I did.
That probably was the National Geographic one then. So they very carefully pieced it together, and as I've said, worked on transcripts and translations and everything else. And even in 2007, when National Geographic published their critical edition with full color photographs of the pages of the text. In fact, this is the book that they published in 2007, and here's an example of a page of the Coptic along with the
Wow.
transcript in the English. I don't know how well you can
Well,
see
actually,
it on there.
I have that picture and I'm showing it right now
That's
to our audience.
perfect.
Awesome.
Yeah.
So anyhow, in the initial transcript that they put on the web in 2006, and a lot of their website is still up. If you Google National Geographic and Gospel of Judas, they've put a lot of content about the Gospel of Judas out there, including their initial transcript. And that and this critical edition in 2007 did not include those fragments that Farini had kept. Those fragments got caught up in litigation in a bankruptcy court in Akron, Ohio, and they were finally turned over in I think 2009, there was debate between lawyers and the banks and people trying to get money out of it. Finally, it was going to be flown and reunited with the balance of the manuscript in Zurich. But the person bringing it to the airport was stopped by customs, and those fragments were detained, and the government of Egypt was contacted, and they demanded immediate repatriation of those remaining fragments to Egypt.
Wow.
So they were sent directly to Egypt, and I don't know if they were ever reunited with the main body of the manuscript. However, photographs were made available. And so since that time, there have been additional revisions to the transcript as the photographs from these additional fragments have been pieced together with the fragments that are already there. So now we have probably 90 or 95% of the whole text already restored. And the translation that I published last year included those 2010 fragments. Most other translations of the Gospel of Judas on the market, including the ones by April DeConnick and Karen King and by others, by Willis Barnstone, most of these National Geographic, most of these translations are only based upon the transcript that was available and the pieces that were available as of 2006. But my translation includes the fragments that were recovered in 2010, which makes it more complete.
I'm just blown away.
No, this is why I loved having you on, because this is I'm so fascinated about history in general, but hearing it from somebody that actually studied and researched
passionate.
And very passionate.
I'm always blown away. We've never had a guest of your caliber on the show ever, Mark, where there wasn't always some politics connected to these things. And there's always politics.
Always.
There's always greed. There's always power struggles. It's mind-blowing to me.
Especially when it's something significant as this.
That could help the whole planet.
Yes.
It's like, I'll just put it in a freezer.
It's just absolutely amazing. It's almost miraculous to have this document because, again, this is the only one that we have.
Oh, of
The,
course.
the only surviving manuscript to date, as far as we know. And uh, additional information about this manuscript, we know that it's authentic because 6 tiny little pieces were cut off and it was sent to a lab in Arizona and radiocarbon dated.
Hmm.
And the manuscript was even earlier than some people had thought it might be. Some people thought maybe it was 5th century. It turned out to date sometime from the late 3rd century to the early 4th century
Wow.
in the Coptic. And so we know for a fact it existed, as late as the early 4th century, if not earlier. But again, based on the citation I shared earlier from Irenaeus in the year 180, we know it was even earlier than that, and that this Coptic text that we have, the only version that we have nowadays, is actually a translation of an earlier Greek text.
Oh,
And we know that in the Greek, this dated
wow.
back a couple hundred years earlier. So this thing, this Gospel of Judas
Hmm.
was written at a time when other Gospels were still being written. It was written at a time when the canon of Scripture, the canon of the New Testament, hadn't even materialized yet. It hadn't even been decided upon yet. This was a very, very early document that tells us a great deal about. It adds a lot more information, as all of these texts do in all of these Gospels, a lot more light on what's happening in the early church as the church was developing and evolving. And one of the great values of this text is that it shows a broader perspective of the power politics that were going on in the church at that time. And as I argue in my book,
Yep.
here's the picture of it for to see what it looks like. This is
Awesome.
available on Amazon.com as a paperback for $5.99 and also on Kindle for $3.99.
Nice.
And if you just want to read the text itself, you can Google my academia.edu website, where I've put out a free public domain translation
Hmm.
of the Gospel of
Well,
Judas,
good for you.
along with a
Nice.
few
That's
other
great.
public domain translations as well. And that is something that you and your viewers can download, copy, distribute, publish, use. They can do whatever they want to with it because I've intentionally placed this translation in the public domain to give it the broadest possible access, or to give people the broadest possible access to this gospel. But as I argue in the book, uh, it really shows a much broader view of the arguments that were happening within the church.
Hmm.
When we look only at the New Testament Gospels and the writings of the church fathers like Irenaeus, we're reading the perspective of church leaders and bishops who were developing and preserving a specific tradition. But there were other traditions and there were other perspectives and other viewpoints. And there were other people within the church, like the author of the Gospel of Judas,
Hmm.
who felt that the bishops in the 2nd century, the church pastors of that time, were corrupt. Um, and these were people who were tracing their authority
Yeah.
back to the 12 disciples of Jesus. The argument essentially was, well, Jesus appointed 12 disciples. The disciples, these 12 apostles, in turn, they appointed their successors and heirs, and they appointed their successors and heirs. And we stand in an unbroken tradition all the way back to the teaching of Jesus. So, what we have in the Gospel of Judas that criticizes not just Judas, but all of the disciples, is basically taking that argument and turning it on its head and saying, okay, you say that your authority goes back to the apostles. Well, guess what? The apostles were all wrong. So you're all wrong too. So the criticism of all the disciples in the Gospel of Judas is basically a very thinly veiled criticism of church leaders in the 2nd century. And this person saying, these leaders of the church, they're leading you astray. You can't listen to them, you know.
Well, what I think's funny is you say corruption in the church at that time. I'm like, a lot has not changed, and it's in certain areas,
That's
and
true.
that's just
Right,
that's just
right.
the truth. I'm a Sagittarius, which means I'm a seeker of truth, and one of the things that I've always had in the back of my mind, and I'm going to ask you since I have you on. You've also wrote a book about the Gospel of Mary, Gospel of Thomas, and I would love to have you back again to talk about a couple of those. But you say it was the Gospels, most of the Gospels were 3rd, 4th, and maybe 5th century. Is that correct?
No, most of the manuscripts that we have
Right.
are from those centuries, but most of the Gospels were written. there are over 30 different gospels.
Okay, that's
honestly,
a lot.
and they were written within the first 3 or 4 centuries. Um, uh, Probably the balance of them were written in the second and third centuries. Even the New Testament Gospels, maybe one or two of them may have been late first
Right.
century, but there, I'd put the Gospel of John at probably the year 100, and the Gospel of Luke even later than that, and the Gospel of Judas a little bit later than the Gospel of Luke. In fact, the Gospel of Judas appears to allude to the Gospel of Luke, so the author appears to have known Luke. However, at the time the Gospel of Judas was written, which we know was somewhere in the middle of the second century,
Hmm.
because it had already reached the further reaches of Europe by 180.
Right.
But during the time of the middle of the second century, when these Gospels were first being written and composed, uh, again, there was no complete collection or by that time there was a collection of the letters of Paul that were circulating,
Hmm.
and there were individual gospels circulating and other scriptural texts. But even as late as the second century, people were still writing these things, some of which became scripture and some of which did not. And it wasn't until much later, in the third and fourth centuries, that the idea of canons of scripture, or which books are in and which books are out, really began to solidify.
Well,
Wow.
the reason I ask, because I'm thinking that I'm a family tree. I love doing ancestry work on my family tree, and I work with other people. I've worked with Eddie's family tree, and I couldn't imagine how people got the information from the time Jesus and the disciples were alive. I mean, I ask people, like, what were your great grandparents' name? They have no idea. How did these people at that time? And I mean, as we can tell, there wasn't no pen and paper.
Well, record keeping.
But you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
We don't. But I mean, we haven't found many other than the Gospels
Well, and then there was storytelling
and
too.
storytelling.
That was a huge
But I mean,
tradition.
my
Right.
dad caught a fish that was 2 pounds, and 5 years later, it was 10-pound bass. So how do we decipher what is legit and what is true? And is the book of Judas, our Gospel of Judas, are these people that knew him, that did he not die? I mean, there's so many questions that it to
Yeah.
me raises than answers.
Yeah, which comes back down to, is some of this too simplistically stated? He said, because she didn't get to say anything.
Right.
He said,
Well,
he said,
Gospel of
he
Mary.
said, he said, he said.
Right. No, those are great questions. And in fact, you may be interested to know that right now I'm working on and finishing up a translation of the Q Gospel that I'll be
Never heard of
publishing
that.
later this year, in which I specifically go into those questions and talk about the criteria of historical Jesus studies, because there are certain criteria that scholars have refined over the last 100 years or so to sift through these literary traditions and ask questions about, would this have been something that the historical Jesus said? Would it not have been, etc. As far as the Gospel of Judas is concerned, I'm pretty confident in saying that there's nothing really historical about the Gospel of Judas, at least nothing in it that accurately represents things that Jesus or his disciples said or didn't say in the first century. I'm pretty sure that it was written, long after Jesus and Judas. So this was someone uh, developing a gospel to tell a story, a narrative way to portray a theology. And that's actually what all of the gospels are. They convey traditions. They rely upon other earlier gospels. Many of these gospels copy from one another. Even in the New Testament gospels, the Gospel of Mark is widely believed to have been the first gospel written, and that was written sometime after the destruction of the temple in the year 70. So that's a good generation after
Right.
Jesus, right? And Matthew and Luke both copied the Gospel of Mark. Matthew copied almost all of it. Luke copied maybe three-quarters of it. And so Matthew and Luke were dependent upon Mark, for example. And here's the interesting thing, because scholars also, recognizing that Matthew and Luke independently copied Mark, then have had to look at approximately or over 200 verses in Matthew and Luke that are word for word nearly identical that don't appear in Mark's gospel, and have to try to account for that. Well,
Oh,
how can they be so similar if they're
Right.
writing independently? Where
Huh.
Matthew and Luke agree with Mark, that's easy to explain. They're just copying Mark. But where they agree and Mark doesn't say anything, where is that coming from?
so even
And so the hypothesis is that there was another document called Q, which comes from a German word that means source. And this hypothetical document would have been a written document, which was a list of sayings that Matthew and Luke incorporated into their gospels that they used alongside the Gospel of Mark. And the Q gospel is believed to have been written sometime between 50 and 70,
Hmm.
basically the middle of the first century. So that gets us closer to the time of Jesus. Now, what we have there are sayings of Jesus, many of which were passed on by oral tradition. One of the things that I argue in my Q book is that the reason Jesus never wrote anything down, the reason he didn't, how much easier this would be, right, if Jesus
Right.
left behind his diary,
That would have
dear
been
diary,
nice, wouldn't it?
or wrote his own gospel, right? But in all likelihood, Jesus was illiterate. Most Galileans were illiterate. Most of the population couldn't read or write, and as an average carpenter, Jesus would not have had that knowledge, and
Right.
nor would his disciples have known how to read or write. In fact, in the book of Acts, Luke specifically says that Peter and John and Jesus' disciples were illiterate. Most Bible translations don't use the word illiterate; they use the word uneducated. But the Greek word literally means illiterate. So
Hmm.
neither Jesus nor his immediate disciples knew how to read or write. These were common fishermen. Now, they knew the scriptures very, very well. They knew many of the scriptures by heart, as many of their as many others did during that time. But oral tradition was very, very strong, and oral tradition is very strong in cultures where most people don't know how to read or write. So the earliest sayings of Jesus were passed along in oral tradition and later written down in sayings collections like Q and like the Gospel of Thomas. And later on, after the destruction of the temple, they were included in a narrative format that included a passion story and a description of the crucifixion of Jesus. So all of these gospels that present these narrative settings, with the exception of the Gospel of Thomas, for example, these narrative gospels are passing along traditions of earlier gospels and earlier sources, both written and oral, and repackaging them in new ways to tell the story in a way that speaks to their contemporaries in the second century or in the third century or whatever. So these gospels tell us a lot about what the churches were dealing with and a lot about their concerns were at that time, which may have been different than the concerns that Jesus himself had or his disciples 100 years earlier, for example.
well, we have literally time always flies when we have a great guest. So we appreciate you for
Amazing.
that, Mark. One last question. In your opinion, your personal opinion, based on everything you know, what is the biggest misconception about Judas?
Or if there was.
Yeah, exactly.
um, I don't know if I would say so much that it's a misconception. Well, I guess to answer your question, I guess a misconception would be that we know very much about Judas.
Yeah.
Uh, what we know a lot of tradition, right?
Yes.
But and Bart Ehrman does a really good job in his book on the Gospel of Judas of tracing this tradition from Mark through Matthew and Luke and other sources, the Gospel of Judas, and on into medieval times. The interesting thing is that as time goes on, Judas accumulates more and more and more negative traits.
Yeah.
Uh, in the earliest traditions in the Gospels, they didn't really say very much about the motivations of Judas. And very little is said about Judas at all in any source. Actually, we know very, very little about the person of Judas, or if Judas really was if one of the disciples was named Judas.
Yeah.
We know very little about him. But as time went on, the tradition made him more and more and more evil and greedy, a money grubber. And both Luke and John say he was inspired by the devil, and John actually calls him a devil. And then the Gospel of Judas calls him the 13th demon.
Wow.
So I mean, as time goes on, the tradition grows more and more and more negative toward Judas. So I think the biggest misconception would be that we really know very much about Judas at all.
Well, and that is so indicative of today's pop culture. If you think about it, he said, she said, da, da, da. And then it's like they'll take a little soundbite of something, interpret it, because everything's open to interpretation, and then it hits a national spotlight, an international spotlight, and it can come back to the same sort of thing, misconceptions.
Mm-hmm. Well, right. I have to say, this is so fascinating. I love this stuff. Some people might think this stuff is not relevant, but this is. I mean, this is our history. This is world history, and that has affected our lives on a daily basis. And I think that's why people need to know about our history. And so I definitely want to have you back, because there's other gospels that we need to talk about.
Yeah,
that
sure, I'd love to.
You've written about, and so. Real quick, and like I say, we have like 2 minutes. Are they still deciphering, or have they translated everything and it's 100% complete, or are they still translating the gospel?
There's work still continues on the gospel, and it will continue for a long time as scholars continue to debate. Is it this character or is it that character? Is it this word or that word? Mm-hmm. How do you translate the word, etc.? But I think as far as and it's still theoretically possible that the more fragments could still emerge on the black market or something. Mm-hmm. It's really hard to say, but what I can tell you is that we have more of it now than we ever have had, and probably the most complete and best transcript that you'll find is in Lance Janot's book on the Gospel of Judas. Unfortunately, it's an academic book that's quite pricey. You might pay $60 for it used on Amazon, or you might buy it for $100. This is one of those books that, maybe 300 copies are published for university libraries, and that's, so it's not easy to get a hold of. But Lance Janot's Coptic transcript is, in my opinion, superior to that of National Geographic's. And I actually came across his book when I was already partway through working on my own translation. And the more I went along, the more heavily I came to rely on Janot's transcript and his work on the Gospel of Judas. And I believe that was published in 2011. So as far as deciphering the Coptic, that's probably one of the better sources. But scholars continue to debate and study, and they'll be studying this for years to come. There are always nuances, as scholars try to figure out, number one, what the text was, and number two, how that text should best be translated and understood.
Wow, we love that.
Well,
So this is Mark Mattison. Thank you, Mark. He's the author of the Gospel of Judas. And one more time, let us tell the audience, please, how they can get in touch with you and check out your websites.
Well, I have an academia.edu website that you can Google. You can Google my name on academia, and you can come across my academia.edu website in that way. And that's where I post my translations, some of my writings, articles, book reviews, and so forth. And then if you just type in my name, Mark Mattison, in Amazon, or if you type in the Gospel of Judas, and you get you get something that looks like this.
Perfect.
It'll be one of the top books listed on Amazon. Both as paperback and on Kindle. And then similarly, my books on the Gospel of Mary and the Gospel of Thomas,
we're going to have
you can also find on Amazon as well for very affordable prices.
Fantastic.
Well, thank you so much, Mark. We really appreciate it. All right. We'll talk to you soon. We're going to get in touch with you to book you again for some other gospel.
Thanks.
Thanks, Mark.
All right. Talk to you later.
Bye.
All right, we are going to take a quick break. We have another great guest for you guys. Nora Harold's going to be in studio with us. But again, if you guys love stuff like this, like me, you're going to definitely want to listen to this podcast again. You're going to check it out on iHeartRadio, iTunes, Stitcher, and then check us out on YouTube. It'll be there probably tonight or tomorrow, but leave a comment, tell us what you thought, and go to our website to truthbetoldwebtv.com. I'm Tony Sweet.
I'm Eddie Connor.
And this is Truth Be Told on Universal Broadcasting Network. Until then,